Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's event of Israeli Apartheid Week in order to raise public awareness about Israel's war crimes and other human rights abuses that fit under the international law definition of the crime of apartheid. And here are our speakers. AminHussain, he is a Palestinian-American lawyer, artist, and activist. He has a BA in philosophy and a JD from Indiana University Law School and an LLM in law from Columbia University. He's a founder of Tidal, Occupy Theory magazine, and a lecturer here at the New School. And he is a founder of NYC Solidarity with Palestine, and he's here speaking on behalf of that, also known as Direct Action Front for Palestine. And he founded it last year at the beginning of Israel's last military assault on Gaza.
So again, my name's Amin, and I'm just gonna jump right in it. And I have three things that I'm going to brush on to put in the room, and then we can hopefully have a conversation about these things. Obviously, the topic is complicated, but the topics that I'm going to cover is the right of return in relation to me as a Palestinian. Raised in El Bira in the West Bank, and then the centrality of the right of return to the overall Palestinian struggle for liberation. And finally, the type of activism that we're doing in the city in relation to the right of return, but the overall Palestinian struggle and the type of solidarity that we're trying to build in this city. And I'll just, the bio is important because the right of return is something that is central to the Palestinian people, but not everyone was displaced, and it's important to recognize that. I was raised in El Bira and Ramallah are a twin city. If you're not from there, you wouldn't recognize the municipal differences, but they're there. In 1948, the large population of the Palestinian people were displaced in the creation of the State of Israel, and then they were displaced afterwards, and they continue to be displaced today. But my family, that was in 1967, they weren't displaced in 1948 or afterwards. We had a house in Ramallah, El Bira, and they weren't displaced in 1967. The Palestinians had learned not to leave their homes in 1948 and not to actually believe people when they said a few days and they could come back, including the Arab regimes. And so what they did, my grandfather and my grandmother went under a fig tree and waited out there for 2 months. And they would go little by little get food because they were afraid to be in the houses in case they were murdered by the Israeli army or the militias at that time. No one expected what would happen. As a Palestinian, I was as a teenager raised during the first Palestinian uprising. That was my political awakening. And during that time, I was 12 or 13 years old, and I was a member of Fatah. I got involved in the organized resistance at the time, which was happening on all levels. And it so happened that I have a Palestinian, that no Palestinian at that time had a Palestinian passport, nor do they right now, except it's issued by Israel, so that's a separate matter. But my involvement there was that I went to jail a couple of times. I was involved in the type of activity that any Palestinian would engage in living under occupation. And I carried that experience when the Oslo Accords happened. I came to the US and I started my educational journey in the hopes of going back and helping my people. That's kind of where I position myself in all of this. So as a person, as a Palestinian, I don't have that claim to a right of return, but we're going to open that up because what does the right of return mean today versus what it meant 70 years ago? And I think that's also an open question that we should negotiate, and it comes up in the context of the activism and the work that we do here. Now, the centrality of the right of return. Before there was any talk about a two-state solution, before there was any talk about peace, right? There was a talk about people who were driven out of their homes to have a right to return to their homes. It's as simple as that. And so the political awakening in the Palestinian struggle that began before the creation of the State of Israel and afterwards was always about that central right of we need to go back to the houses that we left behind, right? That was it. In 1967, right, fast forward to that, in 1967, when there was a loss of the rest of what is known as Palestine historically, there was a political formulation of what that could look like. There was a Palestinian identity that was formulated. There was ways in which to discuss this. This was happening at a time of a decolonization era where the right to self-determination was somewhat synonymous with nation state, so that a people exercised their right to self-determination, it was assumed, by virtue of giving them a state, right? And so how was this going to be resolved? How was the Palestinian issue going to be resolved? People started talking in terms of two-state solution, and there was that notion of, like, within the United Nations, there was always a push towards a two-state solution that became to get more narrow and more narrow until right now it is non-existent. We're at a moment right now, when I say it's non-existent, it's important not to be harsh at the Palestinian condition or what people have done, because their existence on that land until this day is a testament to their struggle and the power of the people to resist. Yet it is one of the most critical junctures in the Palestinian struggle at this point, because you are faced with the real possibility of being ethnically cleansed. You are faced with a real possibility of genocides being able to happen, or of them having some kind of temporality. And the right of return does seem, to the families who have been third or fourth generation living in refugee camps or in the diaspora, is more and more remote. All of those things make the right of return, interestingly enough, the most punished, the most less likely, but for the Palestinian struggle, the cornerstone and first principles. Because at a time when Palestinians are experiencing occupation and apartheid and ethnic cleansing and genocide, not all at the same time, the experience of the occupation varies from one location to the other. And so as a people, we have been divided by the experience of the occupation and the introduction of neoliberalism and the introduction of debt and introduction of the Palestinian Authority as a sub-oppressor, right? All of these things make the struggle of the Palestinians at this juncture, where is the consensus amongst Palestinians, right? And you can find consensus in the three principles that are laid out in BDS. And the first of them is the right to return. And that right to return as a person from the West Bank is essential. I will fight for it. Essential. That's the first right that I put up front, because that is what's going to allow us as Palestinians to be one group resisting for our liberation. Now, the third point that I want to touch on is activism in this city, and the shift that in a way, the activism in this city mirrors what I happily have been experiencing as a Palestinian American, which is the decoupling of Judaism from Zionism, right? I think that's a watershed moment. Mm-hmm. It's a testament for everyone's work and the political awareness that we have in this city. When we came together, and it wasn't just me, it was a bunch of people, and said, we are no longer going to be in the shadows of 9/11. We're no longer going to be fearful as Muslims, fearful as Arabs, fearful as Palestinians. We are going to take direct action. We are going to target Zionist spaces, and we are going to make sure that they know that this kind of racist, oppressive spaces that they have in this city that were left unchallenged will no longer remain that way, unchallenged. And we did that with, Jewish allies. We did that with African American allies, and we'll touch on the point of solidarity. But within that context, it was important not to have these political conversations about what's going to unite us in a solidarity effort for a people whose existence is being threatened. That what we're going to do is that we're going to fight oppression, and we can have our political ideologies on the side, but we're going to prioritize doing something for these people and using the privilege that we have in New York and the access that we have and the media impact that we could make so that our actions communicate that type of solidarity and give the kind of breath that we know people in Palestine are looking for and need. And we did that by targeting specific activities, by creating a group that's Palestinian-led first and foremost, by recognizing that just alliance with Jewish people isn't sufficient for the kind of liberation that we're interested in, that it has to be with people of color, that it has to be first and foremost with black people who share that kind of experience, with Native Americans who shared that kind of experience. So those are kind of the things that I'll say. Those are the three things that I said I'll cover. I have about 1 minute, and I just want for the other speakers and for us to think about the simplicity of the right of return. As a lawyer, I don't believe in law. Law is just a mirror of the status quo. Law is the mirror of power structures. People get too involved in legalese and forget what they're talking about. What are we talking about? A family that needs to go back to their home, right? The second thing is refugees. You know, the thing about refugees is that in some formulation, we're all refugees. The person that gets kicked out of East New York is being made refugee. The people that got pushed out from Hurricane Sandy and had to sell their houses for $30,000 because they couldn't rebuild it and the insurance didn't cover it. So there are climate refugees, there are debt refugees, there are a million kind of refugees. And this is also tied into the fact that Westphalian civilization, the notion of the nation state is crumbling. And when you see things like ISIS, that's just it. Borders matter very little to capital. Borders matter little to people or nation states who have power, drones and so forth, but they still matter to people, right? Because our locations have become like prisons. With that said, there's specificities of struggle and there's a recognition that the Palestinians that were kicked out of their homes are refugees proper. And in that sense, although we can all identify with the notion of refugee, right? We need to maintain that specificity and to recognize that the people that were thrown out of their houses, that live in Yarmouk right now, that are under siege, we need to know that part of the reason why they're dying and getting killed is because they were thrown out of their homes and they can't return, right? That's it.
And now please join me in thanking Students for Justice in Palestine for hosting this event, and Student Senate, and Student Senate for co-sponsoring this event, and in welcoming our speakers.